Welcome to Baseball and Coffee, episode 48 with Tino and Aaron. What's up, Aaron?
Not much. Happy Friday.
And you too, brother. Any reason for the Oakland A's choice today?
My Oakland A's hat is unfortunately getting a little battered.
Mhm.
It's the one I've had the longest. I bought it during the pandemic when I was created an Oakland A's franchise and out of the park baseball. And it was in my little league team. I always think of Dave Stewart and Ricky Henderson and
Mhm.
those guys. And so I chose that team to kind of rebuild. And I bought the hat to wear while I was playing the game because that's the kind of nerd I am. And so anyway, it's I wear it when I play golf, and then I've been doing a lot of yard work, and so I've had it out when I was doing that. All those last couple of days it was so cold, I had to go to the ski cap. But
Yeah,
so it's getting a little dirty, but it was right there on the end of the bed. So I was like,
nice,
I'm doing a podcast, I need to grab a hat, and it
nice.
was right there for me.
Right on,
Um, so
right on. Good stuff. I obviously am a little bit under the weather, but we're going to push through. Um, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the category of average and hits. In our home league, we cover hits, or hits is a category and average is not. But most leagues that I've seen, I think average is a category. And I think what we want to dive into a bit is what characteristics, what stats are you looking at? Are we each looking at individually to determine whether a player is going to be effective in that particular category? I think we talk a lot about power, home runs, right? We talk a lot about steals. We talk a lot about strikeouts with pitchers, but hits or average, whichever one you use, is just as important. Obviously, it's an equal category to the others, and I don't know that we talk as much about that particular category. So I'm excited for this. Uh, we'll also do the obligatory quick coverage of some of the awards that have been awarded already in Major League Baseball after the season has ended. But first, let's talk a little bit about our most recent coffee experiences. You want to start us off?
yeah, I've been brewing blonde espresso, which blonde is the sort of category that Starbucks uses to describe the light end of the spectrum for us and the offerings. And see if you go to a Starbucks and get a blonde latte, I mean, it's the coffee that goes into that, and you can also buy it to brew. I've been brewing that, and I thought of you honestly because it's very aggressively citrus forward.
Mhm.
Um, Not quite, it's still smoother than like a breakfast one, but it's really assertively citrusy and sharp, and I've really been enjoying it. Not quite as soft as the lighter roast I usually have. Usually I go for like a lighter, not lighter, but a softer, rounder if
Sure.
I want a lighter roast, but it's a little more assertive,
Uh-huh.
which is not always a bad thing when I'm trying to wake up, but it's been really enjoyable. And I honestly, I thought of you because I know you like those more assertive, lighter roasts. I'm
Sure.
sure it's not tangy enough for you, but it's definitely on the tangier end for me.
Right. Well, and I think it a lot of it is this is the conversation I used to have both when I worked for Starbucks and then before and afterwards is our palates are built based on repetition oftentimes and they adjust. And Starbucks, I actually don't think we've talked about this on the pod. Starbucks really is responsible for establishing um, the majority of Americans' kind of current uh, um, preference as far as roast profile goes. And Starbucks roasts a lot, I would argue, a lot darker than most every other coffee roaster. And so that's where the American palate lies, which is neither good nor bad. I think it's just a preferential thing. Um, so my palate happens to land a lot more on that lighter roast side where you do get a lot more citrus. And I think that's the off-putting part for a lot of people who are used to drinking darker roasted coffee is that really citrusy high note that people might call, it's not acidic, but people call it as acidic or acid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's very, I will contrast that type of coffee. Even so for me, even a Starbucks blonde roast is still dark compared to what I'm used to, right? And so my coffee experience over the last couple of weeks was there was a young guy here in Walla Walla who ran a coffee trailer essentially for a couple of years, and he had all the coolest stuff. He had a Malconic grinder. He sourced beans from Hart and from Bluebeard and Tacoma and Kuma Coffee, which is who I used in Seattle, and cool dude. But it's really cool to see him build that cart into a shop. So he has a brick and mortar now, right in downtown Walla Walla. I'm sure it costs a pretty penny. His coffee costs a pretty penny now, in part because of it. I had a shot of espresso that was $4.50. That was not a special shot; it was just a shot. I think an Americano was $5, I believe. But the interesting part was I literally walked in and had flashbacks of myself. I guess it was 13 years ago, because at first glance the shop was very cool. It had cool equipment, um, but nothing was fit from a construction standpoint. Nothing was finished, right? You had paint that needed to occur. I could see the tables kind of look cool, but I could tell how they were put apart or put together. And I'm sure that him and his friends put it together. But there's a romance in that too. And
Yeah.
and I was really, on the one hand, like, the older person in me is like, hey man, make sure it's finished first before you open up. On the other hand, I know what it's like to open up a shop on a string, and you do what you can as you can, and you hope to rely on your level of service and the quality of your product to get people to continue to come back. And so it was just it was really, I had this wave of not emotion, but wave of experiences that came back to me when I walked in that I don't think about all the time anymore. So I think that's part of the business side, and the romance side of coffee is one that I'm not involved with anymore, but it was a major part of my life for a long, long time. And I was appreciative that I could have that particular kind of personal experience walking into that shop. So good luck, Josh.
Mm.
It was super cool. Super cool. All right, man. Average hits. Or excuse me, we're gonna go on to the awards first. My bad.
You're
Uh,
changing the rundown on me.
exactly. So let's start with the American League MVP. Um,
Okay.
as we all know, the American League MVP this season was Aaron Judge. He had 28 first place votes. Shohei Ohtani had the other two first place votes. The top, I'm going to say the top 7 in order, so I can include Julio, was Aaron Judge, Shohei Ohtani, Yordan Alvarez. Jose Ramirez was third. Jose Ramirez was fourth. Jose Altuve was fifth. Andres Jimenez was sixth, and Julio Rodriguez was 7. Um, what is your initial reaction to the MVP voting in the American League, or what thoughts might you have?
I mean, it was what I expected. I wasn't surprised. Um, the only thing I wonder looking at the list is, how high might have Ramirez finished given what the Guardians did unexpectedly had he not been battling the wrist and hand injury the second half of the year. I mean, he was still really productive, but he did suffer a little bit.
Uh-huh.
That was really the only thought I had. I remember when you and I had the midseason, I was, comparing Alvarez and Judge in terms of the quality of contact and what they were doing from a power standpoint. But clearly Judge pulled away and put up those immense counting stats, and really had a historical season. So, I mean, it was the result I expected.
So are we going to talk about the elephant in the room or not?
I
So
mean, I'm not gonna pipe for Otani. I mean, I don't think it's just hard to argue what Judge did. His offensive season wasn't what it was last year. Though I think you can argue maybe he was probably a more rounded hitter if you look under the hood
mhm.
of what Otani did, but he didn't have the eye-popping home run tally that he had the prior year. So those home runs and steals, they make a big difference.
So I think Otani was the MVP, and I think as long as he is a even a not an elite offensive player, but a very, very good offensive player, and he continues to pitch the way that he does, I don't think there's in my opinion, my own baseball opinion, there's no debate from for my money, right? I get the season that Judges put up. I don't think anyone understands A, the difficulty of doing the two, obviously the pitching and hitting, but also what you might pay for that particular performance, right? As a major league franchise for Otani, hitter Otani or pitcher Otani, he's probably worth, it's probably a $35 million salary on either side, right? Because you're talking about a potential 40-40 guy, you know, as a hitter. If he didn't pitch, he would probably run, I'm assuming he would run a little bit more, right? And he would focus more on his craft. And I think you're looking at least a 40-20 guy. He still hit 34 home runs and he had 11 steals and he was 90 runs, 95 RBIs, but on a really, really bad team. Um, and as a pitcher, he finished, where did he finish in the Cy Young vote pitching?
He was fourth. I mean,
Right.
yeah. I was more irked that he finished fourth there than I was about the second to Judge, honestly.
Really? See, I disagree.
I knew he wasn't going to beat Verlander, but I thought he should have been second.
See, I
Uh,
don't agree with that personally, but it's the MVP that I think is, because I do think he is the most valuable player in baseball, right? And that's what MVP means to me. Um, and yes, Judge had an historically amazing season as a hitter, a season that we haven't seen in the modern era really outside of, I would say, Bonds.
sure.
But it's still, he still wasn't pitching 150 innings, right? Of incredibly effective baseball. That the pitcher Otani on the open market would probably get $40 million a year just as a pitcher. So I don't know. I am of the opinion Otani was my AL MVP. Um, I do think Alvarez deserved to be third. I just think, especially if we're taking into account the postseason at all. Um, and I would, if I had to pick a voters MVP for next year, Alvarez would probably be my favorite.
Hmm.
Um, I kind of think he's becoming that best player in baseball or close to it, behind Otani. And then the other one, or the other two that I think are worth mentioning is it's jarring to see Andres Jimenez at 6
Hmm.
just because of what you might associate with the name, right? I think
Hmm.
of a low average, maybe double digit home runs and steals guy that was a part of the deal for Francisco Lindor, not an explosive offensive player in the way that he's been. And then of course Julio, who's been going 1-1 in some of the early 2023 NFBC drafts. I just think the sky's the limit for him, obviously. But interesting in the American League. National League. The National League MVP was Paul Goldschmidt. Second was Manny Machado. Third, Nolan Arenado. Fourth, Freddie Freeman. Fifth, Mookie Betts. Sixth, Austin Riley. And seventh, JT Realmuto. Initial thoughts with the NL MVP.
I was confused by this result. Goldschmidt and Arenado splitting votes at 1 and 3. To me, I kind of initially thought, well, Freeman and Betts, they're lower because they both play for the Dodgers and they're kind of, so you can argue like, well, there's another great player on that team. But then you have Goldie and Arenado 1 and 3. Like, why doesn't that logic apply there? So I'm just kind of confused. Like, to me, Manny Machado was the player who, if you want to take value, like kind of your Otani argument, here's what he meant to that team. Both sides of the, in the field and at the plate. I don't know. To me, he stood alone on that team. Like there were not a lot of great hitters in that lineup every day. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you had guys who would have their moments, but up and down that lineup was not very deep, especially pre-trade deadline. And and him playing, I don't care what the awards say, a gold glove level defense at third. I just don't see it. I don't know what the Cardinals did that was so much more deserving of recognition than what the Padres accomplished, led by Machado, not by himself, but I think he stood above in a way where I was doing it. And I think again, I think what the season Freeman posted, I mean, a little less power than Goldschmidt. I think those home runs really do carry these kind of awards.
Sure.
But you look at what Freeman did. I mean, 117 runs, 100 RBIs.
Mm-hmm.
His batting average is, he just batted second over 700 plate appearances. I mean, every single day in the two hole for a team that won, 108 games. Um, I feel like he should be higher. He
right?
didn't have to win, but I feel like it is more deserving, honestly, than Goldschmidt.
Hmm. It's I think with the top, I would say the top six, right? I'm going to put Lindor in there. It's kind of I think it's picking nits basically. With those top six, for me, Lindor deserves to be there. I would put him in there uh over Riley personally, because of the position he plays.
Hmm.
And not just playing shortstop, because you can put a body at shortstop and say they play shortstop, but he plays an above average, a plus defensive shortstop still. Um, I'm with you. I don't know if it's because I'm not in love with Paul Goldschmidt as a player, and I think I've tended to underrate him because I don't love him as a player. If that's what's shaping a bit of my opinion, but out of say the top six, he's like the one guy that I don't like as much, and I didn't think deserved it. I'm with you with the Manny argument. Manny was I think led a team that was mired in mediocrity for a long, long time to the playoffs. Played a plus third base. I don't think he's the third baseman he was in Baltimore. I think he's gotten a lot bigger, but he played an above average third base. 100 runs, 102 RBIs, 32 home runs. I wonder if he would have hit 2 points higher if he would have won the MVP. He hit
Hmm.
298. I wonder if he
Hmm.
crossed that 300 threshold, because Goldie was 317. Um, and to your point, Freeman was 325. But I think Goldie's 35 home run total plus the 317 average is probably what voters looked at, and they just decided it was him. I honestly, if you would have given it to any of the top six, uh, I wouldn't have necessarily had an issue with it. Maybe Arenado is the one who I might have had the most issue with out of the top six. But Betts, nobody's talking about the fact that Betts had 35 home runs and 117 RBIs. He had the same amount of home runs as Goldschmidt and 11 more RBIs than he did, and 5 more steals. It's just his average was lower. And average can be such a variable stat, right?
No, 100% with you, and I know you mean runs on RBI.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sorry about that.
It's
So
okay.
one interesting thing with like so Betts, kind of segueing eventually into our topic for the day. Betts hit 269 with the 272 BABIP, and Goldschmidt hit 317 with the 368 BABIP. So say their BABIPs get more in line with one another, then you're really trying to kind of sift through to see who plays the more important defensive position, who had more steals, that sort of thing, to decide between Goldschmidt and Betts. So yeah, I think the top six are great. Um, I wouldn't have picked Goldschmidt myself. I understand why voters did. Um, if I was to dig a little more, I probably would flip it all on its head. You'd see Freeman in the top three, Machado probably one, Lindor and Betts probably above the two Cardinals hitters, but that's just me. All right. AL Cy Young. So this is the one you said you had the issue with.
No,
Uh,
I mean, I expected Verlander to win. 18 wins, a sub 2 RA. I think he was deserving 100%.
uh-huh,
I was just, I thought Otani deserved to be higher than fourth.
uh-huh.
That's the Otani fan in me.
Yeah,
I watched him pitch head to head against Manoa. I watched him pitch head to head against McClanahan, Valdez, playing on the weaker team. Stop losing streaks multiple times. Added a two seam in the middle of the year. He's got a K rate, K per nine that rivals Cease without the command issues. You can't compete with Verlander sub 2 RA and 18 wins. He's not going to hit those stats like you said, like average and home runs for hitters, like wins and ERA. No
sure.
matter how we know from a fantasy perspective they can be not always indicative of the quality of the pitcher, but when you post those numbers, you're going to get the much deserved recognition. But yeah, I just watched him outpitch a lot of those guys on that list, and I feel like skills wise, you know, um, again he outpitched them head to head a lot of times as I watched it.
Right. So
And there's a little emotion there too, because we talked about in the preseason. I just don't think he gets enough attention for his pitching, and so
sure.
there's a little emotion there for me, a little axe to grind for sure.
So do you? It sounds like you do value some of the head-to-head stuff as a part of your evaluation. Is that right?
Well, yeah, it paints how I look at these guys in comparison to each other when I watch the game with my own eyes,
Sure.
and you have, I mean, and like Manoa Otani was pretty late in the season. It was a very competitive game back and forth,
Right.
but and Otani got the best of that, and the Angels won the game, and he's facing a much stronger lineup, and Manoa pitched very well that day as well.
Sure.
But we both know the Angels are a train wreck.
Right.
Anyway.
I think for me at least, I less important is the head to head as much as it is what's the defense behind you, right? If we're looking at win totals, what's the offense that's supporting you? Some of those things matter to me quite a bit more. I've already spoken about the fact that I do think Otani was pretty darn great. Uh, I don't know that I would have put Manoa above Otani. That maybe the one differentiator would be that Manoa gave him 30 more innings. And that's something to be, I do think that's something to be considered when voting. Uh, but to me, like you said, it's Verlander and everyone else. And I do think that there isn't a ton to differentiate between the everybody else. They're in a clump. Uh, the one that I think is worth mentioning that was just a very interesting stat line is Framber Valdez.
Mm-hmm.
So he went 17-6. He pitched 201 in third innings. But the stat that I think is wild and I'll be really interested to see next year is that he is 66.5% ground ball, which is insane to me,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And when you watch him pitch, he looks almost more unhit. He looks more unhittable to me than darn near anybody that we watch, because you don't know if it's a high 70s curveball or a turbo sinker coming, right? And they're coming out of the same eye level. He's just, I don't know. Framber Valdez is super interesting.
Yeah, he was the guy I would have pushed up from that lower group to pushed up, honestly. And that might be colored by what he did in the postseason as well a little bit.
uh
It's hard to let go of that completely.
I don't have all of his stats here. I can find them. The other interesting
Uh,
one is that I think is a little bit, I don't even know if where did he finish? Um, Kevin Gosman finished 10th. I've heard a lot. There's been a lot of kind of background conversation about how to value Gosman. I think we talked a little bit about it. Maybe it was or just into the season, because he surrendered. Where is it here? 188 hits and 174 and 2/3 innings last year, right? And so at
mhm.
first glance, I don't think of a very good pitcher when you surrender more hits than innings. Um, but his whip was still, where is it here? I'm not finding it. Oh, 124 was his whip, but his BABIP was 363. So you're talking about a pitcher with the 124 BABIP who surrendered 188 innings and 174 and 2/3, or 188 hits and 174 and 2/3 innings, yet he still finished 10th on the ballot. Um, Another just weird and interesting stat line. Uh, One other question for you. I think it's safe to say that Manoa, Otani, Valdez, McClanahan, Bieber, Cole will probably all finish within like 85 to 90% of what they did this year, barring injury in 2023. Um, the one that I think has some variance is Dylan Cease. What do you expect from Cease in going into 23 without really deep diving into his performance last year quite yet?
Um, I would probably fade him a little bit, just not because I think he'll necessarily take a step back, but I just think there's a little bit more volatility in the profile. And then from a redraft perspective, his acquisition cost is going to be much higher. You
Mm-hmm.
won't be able to get him, in the mid range anymore.
Sure.
And so you'll have to pay a higher sticker price. And then again, just his command, I think there's a little bit more volatility. So I'd be a little bit more reticent to buy in at that higher cost.
Got it. And then just for shits and giggles, what would your top five have been if you were a voter?
Looking at the list of names now, Verlander, Otani, Valdez, um, Manoa, McClanahan.
I would have been Verlander, Valdez, Otani, McClanahan, um, probably Manoa over Cease. I love Cease, but I just think Manoa was a little bit more consistent, I believe.
He was.
He might not have given the Blue Jays the same dynamic starts that Cease did at times, but Manoa seemed to be more consistent. And at just off memory, I would assume that Manoa went deeper into starts on average than Cease did.
Yeah, he
Uh,
had 196 innings and Cease had 184. And Manoa did that in 31 starts and Cease had 32. So that is definitely bears out.
got it. NL Cy Young, Sandy Alcantara won the Cy Young. He had all. Did he have all 30 first place votes? Is that right?
He did.
Yep. Max Fried was second. Julio Urias was third. Aaron Nola was fourth. Zach Gallen fifth. Carlos Rodon sixth, and Corbin Burns seventh. It is worth noting Edwin Diaz was ninth, and Ryan Helsley, I think, was 12th, maybe.
Yeah, I saw a couple of closers thrown in there.
Okay.
Cy.
That's kind of annoying, but let's get started with this one. I'm just such not a fan of valuing relievers, at individual relievers at that level, but that's a conversation for another time. Um, Alcantara is just the man this year. Uh, Pitched incredibly well. Um, Tons of innings, right? We started to almost worry about his health as he was approaching the end of the season, but he was just dominant. I don't think there was anybody close or even worth arguing, came close to Alcantara in the National League by the end of the season. Any thoughts, opinions around Fried, Urias, Nola, Gallen, Rodon, Burns, kind of those guys?
No, I would just say the one thought I had looking at the list is, I take an L on Urias. I was lower on him coming into the season. So for him to post another 17-win season, um, with an ERA under 2.5.
2.16, yeah.
Yeah, so definitely someone I have to reassess. I mean, he does give up a few more homers, but he's shown that he can uh, take the ball 175 innings. The Dodgers just will use him, and he had was it 20 or 21 wins last year, so backing up with 17. So that was one. My thought was he's someone that I misvalued coming into the year for sure.
Me too. I was really worried about his reduction in velocity, and I just thought that he was entering a danger zone where his fastball was not fast enough to really differentiate, and that it was going to get hit. The one thing, he has a couple of like old man skills that I love. Right, he doesn't walk anybody, so 2.1 walks per nine, which was a good for a 6% walk rate last year. Slightly above his walk rate in 21, which is 5.1, 24.1% K rate, which is not great, right?
Yeah.
But he has the ability he really stranded runners this year. So his strand rate was 86.6. We would probably see some regression next year with that, but he had an 0.96 whip, right? And is just a really, really effective pitcher who I think people are going to. Here's how I'll say it. He's a pitcher who someone like you or I, admittedly, would look for faults and reasons why he can't continue winning the way that he did. And I think we did that in the offseason. I especially did that. Whereas he might be an example of a pitcher that we need to really focus more on his strengths and understand that he's a lot better than we thought he was, right? But I do think there's some area for regression for next year. Like I said, his strand rate went up over 10%, which really helped him a lot. His BABIP was 229 last year. It was 272 the previous year. His walk rate went up slightly. His K rate went down slightly. So there's some little warning signs after I talk about trying to focus on his strengths. But he's probably someone I'll still stay away from a bit. But yeah, very much deserving of that
Well,
place.
that's easy in our home league because the owner who has him is never going to trade
Never
him.
going to give him up. Totally.
I know one thing that stuck out to me before we close on pitching.
Yeah.
And this honestly, I read this in regards to Tyler Anderson. You look at batting average on balls in play. So Urias, his BABIP was 229,
Uh-huh.
which is exceptionally low. League average BABIP is 292. And you look at similarly, Verlander's is at 240. And the reason why this came up with the Tyler Anderson discussion is how much of his success, as a someone who obviously got more swing and miss his changeup, but as a contact control type pitcher, a lot of balls in play. And the Dodgers front office and Intel, and as well as the Astros being two of the front runners in, just baseball intelligence and research and things like that, and their ability to position defenders and positions to make plays on the balls in play. And you see those super low BABIPs for those two pitchers and those two organizations. And then you think about the shift adjustments and how well those type of organizations,
Mm-hmm.
um, adjust and find new ways to gain advantage with the new set of rules. And how much of that honestly just the skill of the pitcher. It's hard to say, but I think there's definitely some confluence there. And then you also have, it's interesting to me to see, we really look for those guys that have a higher ground ball rate, and it's interesting to look at this list of pitchers. Have the top four in each league, and the ground ball rates range from, all the way down to 37.5 and all the way up to 53.4.
Mm-hmm.
So, Fried and Alcantara really kind of lead the ground ball types. And then you got your fly ball types with Verlander and Cease and Manoa. So it's just there's a lot of ways to succeed. And it's not just one way, but it's anyway, those are things that I kind of want just looking forward and thinking about 2023.
Do you so I find it interesting too. I think that I wonder about Tyler Anderson, and you kind of alluded to this. Like, was his success? He looked like a successful pitcher coming into 22 before he signed with the Dodgers, but not the success that we saw him have. How much of it is, you always wonder, how much of it was a product of the Dodgers defense and teaching him, little ways to adjust with his pitches, and will that carry over when he moves across town with the Angels? Usually, for me, the answer is no. It doesn't mean that the underlying skills are still there, and he's still going to be very good, but I don't think he's going to be the same pitcher because of that.
Right. Yeah,
Um,
I mean, he's a skilled pitcher, right? And he has skills for sure, but isn't going to produce the fantasy stats and the
sure.
results the same
And,
way.
and if he has Trout in center and Renhefo and Fletcher behind him, he's not going to have the same sort of defense, right? Without the intelligence of the front office to be able to kind of shape what that defense looks like. We've got about 2 minutes before our break. Any quick thoughts on the American and National League Rookie of the Year?
From a fantasy perspective, I have to say, the categorical juice is what these young guys was kind of astounding to me. You got Julio with the 28-25 season, Witt a 20-30 season, Pena with a 22-11 season, and a Harris with 19-20. I mean, you got these guys coming in and pushing these 20-20 type seasons, 20-30, 25-25 for Julio, and really just giving us, that categorical, we being fantasy players, pretty astounding. And then also a lot of these guys as well, highlighted by Witt, Pena, and Harris, really, really low walk rates. And so how much will they adjust?
Right.
I
Is
know
it
as they mature a
sustainable?
little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's something interesting to think about fantasy wise. But obviously, I mean, a great group, and I think both Julio and Harris, were deserving.
Right. So I have a couple of quick thoughts in the last 45 seconds here. It's egregious that Adley Rutschman got a vote. I like Rutschman a lot, but I thought it was pretty messed up that he got one over Julio. I just think Julio was head and shoulders above him. I love seeing Quan move up as high as he did. I think he's a grinder and a baller. And I do think Strider deserves the National League. I just think what Strider did was kind of out of this world, and we didn't reward it in the way that we could. And I hope that in the future we have a pitcher and a hitter of the year, even if it was for both leagues together and not just individual leagues, because we're not recognizing George Kirby, we're not recognizing Spencer Strider in the way that I think that we should. So
Well
let's
said.
take a quick break. We'll come right back with our deep dive into hits and average.
Sweet.
All right. Hits and average. Let's see where to start. So, what are some of the things that you quickly look for when identifying players at the top of this category?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing I think of is contactability, and the
Mhm,
second thing I think of is speed. And I think what I valued about this exercise was trying to push beyond those immediate perceptions. I'm thinking that someone who makes a lot of contact is automatically going to hit for a good average.
mhm,
Um, because it's not necessarily the case. And I chose this when you had the discussion of covered, I had topics and we had this idea of talking about categories. I chose average because it was to the area of what we struggled the most with offensively in our TGFBI team.
mhm.
So I thought it might be an interesting way as you start the off season to kind of look more closely at the category.
So I'm going to jump all the way down since you brought these up. I'm going to jump all the way down to my conclusions. So the exercise that I did was I took the top 10 hitters that qualified for the batting championship in average in the major leagues and dug deeper into each of those 10 and then came up with some conclusions that I found in those 10. So from 1 to 10, it was Jeff McNeil at 326, Freddie Freeman, Paul Goldschmidt, Luis Ariz, Aaron Judge at 311, Xander Bogaerts, Jordan Alvarez, Jose Abreu, Andrew Benintendi, and Nathaniel Lowe. Those are the top 10, right? Um, so the first conclusion that I wanted to bring up, and it's interesting that it was the first characteristic that you brought up, is that surprisingly to me, speed was, at least in 2022, speed was not indicative of a high average or more hits in the way that I would historically think. And from a savant perspective, the highest speed, can you guess what the highest speed in the top 10 was from a savant perspective?
Yeah, I'm looking at the list now. I know McNeil's time to first is really good, so I'm gonna go with him.
It was Xander Bogaerts, and he was in the 64th percentile. So
Okay.
the highest speed from a percentile perspective of the top 10 averages in Major League Baseball last year was 64th. And it was from a shortstop that's not known for his speed or his steals. And so that was the first takeaway that I had. I was like, holy shit, okay, let me wipe out all of these kind of um, maybe stereotypes that I may have had of what made a great average hitter. The second one was of the top 10 average players, which or how many players had a K rate higher than league average? And the answer is two. So only two of those 10 had a K rate higher than league average. One was Nathaniel Lowe, who I think is the outlier, one of the outliers on this list. And the reason he made the list was that his BABIP was so high. And the other one was Aaron Judge, whose hard hit rate is completely astronomically through the roof. Um, and then there's a bunch of other stuff that I'll bring up as we dig in a little bit more. But to your point earlier, the other conclusion that I came up with that I think is pertinent in this moment is that only 3 players on this list had a swinging strike rate of above 10%. And league average was 11.2. So I think the idea that contact, obviously, it makes sense that you would say that contact equates to higher average, or good contact rate does. But only Judge, Bogaerts, and Nathaniel Lowe had a swinging strike rate of above 10%. And again, league average was 11.2%. So low swinging strike rate, which equates typically to a high contact rate, is a really, really good place to start. But that speed is not necessarily indicative of a highest end average. Are there players that you want to discuss that you dug into from 22?
So what I did was I looked beyond 2022. I looked
Mm-hmm.
at career batting average
Uh-huh.
for active players.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I looked at and then I crossed that with skills that I correlate with batting average as being end zone contact, hard hit rate, right? So how hard you hit the ball, because you look at the list from last year, for example, like Goldschmidt and Judge, right?
Sure.
They hit the ball hard, so that is one way to hit for a higher average because you hit it so hard that it gets to the infield and it gets to the wall and those kind of things, right? then launch angle, right? So what angle are you hitting your balls? That makes a difference. And then ground ball and fly ball rates. What is the mix there?
Yep.
And then finally, home plate to first time. So I looked at home plate to first instead of sprint speed.
Uh-huh.
Sprint speed represents that top speed, but in terms of batting average, I thought home plate to first times um, would be more applicable.
Uh-huh.
So for context, like sub 4.2 is elite. So like Trey Turner is 4.14 to first. And so then I looked at, again, standing career average and then how they relate to these skills. And I kind of like found three different players. I would start with the one I think is the most prototypical at the way that I would think of as an average hitter. These are guys who have very similar metrics and are very high on like the career batting average list to date. And this is like your Luis Arises and your Jose Altuve's and Jeff McNeil, right? What I found was all of these hitters had a contact rate above 88%, and league average is 84. So, much, much higher than league average. All of them, though, were very closely clustered with a hard hit of only around 30%, which is lower than league average. With a launch angle, 13 to 16%, again, very tightly clustered. With a ground ball rate around 41%, again, very tightly clustered. A fly ball rate of 23 to 25%. And their times to first were really varied. So, like you, I found the speed was not as big of an indicator as I thought.
Right.
The other correlation I found was really interesting is they all had a sub 9% walk rate.
Mm-hmm.
So, all of these high contact, this type of hitter who has a high batting average swings a lot.
Yep.
And so then in turn, they don't walk a lot. But to your point as well, the strikeout rates were from 8 to 12%.
Yep.
So they're striking out at a very low rate, but they're also walking at a low rate because they swing so much.
I think if you would have added Stephen Kwan to that, even with 1 year, I if you would have added him to that list, I think he would have fit probably all of those categories. 'Cause I think
Well,
Kwan,
you're beating me to the punch. So then what I
okay,
did the next was for each type of player, and I have two more if we get to
sure.
them. For this each type of player, I looked at a player who wasn't on the list who I think could take a step into that category.
Uh-huh.
Stephen Kwan was that player
Interesting.
for this type of player.
Sure.
However, I will say that he is an outlier in a couple areas, both positively and negatively. So he's an outlier positively in that his sprint speed is elite.
Mm-hmm.
So he is 2/100 slower to first than Trey Turner.
Mm-hmm.
So he's much faster than any of the group that I just gave on average. His zone contact rate is 94%, which is equal to Luis Arise, who is very slow.
Uh-huh.
However, what he has to gain to get into this group from a metric standpoint is he needs to increase his hard hit rate. So all three of these guys hovered around 30%. He was at 20.8,
Mm-hmm.
and his launch angle was 11.8, whereas all these guys were in that 13 to 15 range.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he's a very interesting player where he has a lot of commonalities with this type of hitter, but he has maybe even more elite contact skills and more speed.
Right.
But to get where they are in terms of being elite batting average over a career, he needs to make some slight adjustments to launch angle and hard hit.
Mm-hmm.
But he would be my candidate for the player to step forward from this type of profile.
Got it. I I started to look a little bit at zone contact and O contact, and with regards to this particular stat, I'm interested to hear if you found any sort of like what you found, because my intuition says that it's less important than maybe we think it is. It's contact rate is important, but
Yeah.
Z contact versus O contact would be less important because a lot of these guys are going to make solid contact with a lot of different with a pitch basically anywhere. And what is more important for that, those stats are more important for me with regards to power players. And so in a couple of different ways. One is if you're a slugger and your zone contact is incredibly low or way below average, I have a lot of worries about obviously about your swing and miss. Or if you're like a Luis Matos type who makes contact with virtually everything he swings at, but doesn't have a discerning eye, then there's also issues because you're going to hit in the low 200s because you're not hitting quality pitches, right?
Right.
Whereas what we're finding with regards to hits and average is that while there is some correlation with hard hit, you can also be below average hard hit and hit for a high average because you understand where to hit the ball and because you're making so much contact, right?
Yeah.
If your launch angle is in line. So that's one thing. The other one is I did find the same thing with regards to launch angle, that my optimal that I found was somewhere between 10 and 15, which is a little wider range. And
Yeah.
that of the top 10 average hitters last year, Jose Abreu and Nathaniel Lowe were the only hitters in the top 10 with anything lower than 10 degrees. And they were both at 8 degrees even.
Yeah.
So that went actually counter to a little bit of my thoughts in the past, which is if you hit more ground balls, you have, maybe it was too simplistic that if you hit more ground balls, you would have a higher average but less power. But average actually there is a sweet spot that is not low. That's kind of right there in the middle.
So let me go through my next
Yeah.
correlation that I found. So this group, I think, is typified by players like Freddie Freeman and Goldschmidt.
Uh-huh.
You could also throw Corey Seager into that mix, Xander Bogaerts as well. So what I found with this group of high average hitters in their careers is their zone contact was more in the 80 to 85% range.
Uh-huh.
So more closer to league average, a little bit of variance on either side, but in that lower 80s, lower to mid 80s. However, their hard hit rate jumped way up over the other group, 47 to 48%. So these are guys who are making a little less contact, but are really hitting the ball harder on a much more consistent basis. And also, they're hitting the ball on the ground less, usually in 39 to 40% range, whereas our previous group is above 40 in the low 40s,
Uh-huh.
and their fly ball rates were higher, usually in the high 20s, where the other group was in the low to mid 20s.
Huh.
So they're lifting it more, they're hitting it harder, they're hitting it on the ground less. They're, however, striking out sub 20%, but they're walking 12 to 13%. All of these guys in this group who hit for a high average were walking consistently 12 to 13%,
Uh-huh.
which is significantly higher than our previous group. So that was my second player type that I found, was that sort of, again, hard hitter, someone who makes league average or better than league average hard contact, but hits the ball hard, walks in the 12 to 13% range, and has a little bit more consistent lift to
Sure.
get the average. So not in that excessive fly ball range where it's going to hurt your average, but enough lift where you're getting a lot of doubles and things like that. And they're not reliant on speed, because none of this group has speed to beat out hits on the infield, but they have enough speed, to leg out a double.
So you put Seager in this list, but I think this is career numbers?
Yes,
Okay.
this
I
is career.
wonder I wonder if Seager's extreme kind of approach shift last year puts him in a different category. Because he was 307 hitter in 20, 306 in 21, then he hit 245 last year. And if you just look rudimentary, like BABIP, his BABIP was 242 last year, and you say, well, he was a product of bad luck. But the reality is, as you know, he shifted his approach pretty drastically. His launch angle is at 13.6, but previously it was at 10.7. His barrels went down, his hard hit went down, and it looks like he tried to pull. He's kind of trying to yank everything out, essentially. His pull percentage went up over the previous year by 5%, which is to say that you can take a hitter and we can study them and predict what they're going to do the next year based on their past. But that doesn't guard us against a shift in approach that could be better or worse, right? If Stephen Kwan decides he's a power hitter next year, which he won't, but if he did, then all of a sudden he's a mediocre power hitter, not a hitter for great average, which I guess makes the unpredictability of this a little bit nerve wracking, at least for me.
So my off chart candidate who may jump up
Yeah.
is a player we both really like, and that is Will Smith.
Uh-huh.
So the adjustment that Will Smith would need to make is to his launch angle, but it's opposite of the way that we often talk about. He's hitting the ball, fly ball rate is 37%, and his launch angle is 18%. So he's leaning too hard, too heavy into the fly ball lean and getting too much lift. So if he's able to adjust that and drive the ball more often, he has the contact, hard hit, and ground ball rates and quality of contact to get into this type of profile where you could see him hit for a much higher average, I believe, based on these other hitters who, again, get a little less loft on their swing
Uh-huh.
because they're not hitting as many fly ball outs.
Do you think that Dodgers will push him towards that?
I don't know. I mean, to me, he's 27. You know, catchers develop later, so he's entering in his peak years. The next couple of years, I would argue, is going to be his peak season. So we might see, you know, an adjustment or a growth a couple more times. But certainly, I mean, he's been very productive. So I don't think there's anything from a fantasy or even from a Dodgers perspective that he's lacking, but more just he might be someone who might spike, you know, 280, 285 season with a slight, even it may not be an adjustment, it might just be he has a year where he hits the ball lower a little bit, and he might spike a 285 average because again, I think based on his skills, his contact and hit rates, his profile suggests to me he has that type of season in him.
Yep. I think it would be a product of, I don't think that the Dodgers are going to, they preach pretty high launch angle. That's kind of their organizational philosophy. You have players that don't hit that way on their team, but that's kind of what they're known for. It's part of the organizational philosophy. His launch angle has come down each year of the last 3 years. Is 24.2 degrees in 20, which is way too much loft. In 21, it was 19.4, and in 22, it was 18.4. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but if that progression continues, I think to your point, you could see the average in hits come up a bit. But I think that he's so productive as it is that if I'm the Dodgers, I really don't want him to change anything, right? I think that if you tweak and he's thinking too much about the tweak, he might become less of a player. The other argument is his OPS has gone from, in 20, it was smaller sample, obviously, but his OPS in 20 was 980, 21, it was 860, and 22 was 807. And so as his launch angle has gone down, his OPS has also gone down. So it's also correlated, or is potentially directly related to his plate appearances going up over the course of time as well. So I think personally, when I look at that, I think his performance is as tied to maybe fatigue and keeping him fresh as a catcher as it is really anything else. I would say to him, continue doing what you're doing. We're going to try to keep you in the sweet spot of like kind of 450 to 500 plate appearances and just mash in those plate appearances. And let's just keep going. Right.
Right.
But yeah, I think he could spike, and it would not surprise me at all if he hit 290 next year. Cool. What's the third profile?
All right. So the third profile is the Trey Turner profile.
Uh-huh.
So he's someone that he really didn't fit to either prior group, but he's someone who has a 302 career average and is someone who is a fantasy gold mine in the last 3 or 4 years. So I kind of wanted to look at what is what do his metrics look like, and if you're looking for someone who might be able to succeed with that type of skill set, what that might be. So Trey has a much lower launch angle than either of the prior group. His launch angle is around 10%. He has a much higher ground ball rate, 44%, which is higher again than either of our first groups. However, again, he has that super elite time to first base. Does, however, a sub 20% K rate, so that fits the overall theme that you mentioned in the beginning. To have a high average, you can't swing and miss a ton if you're going to be in that upper tier. But he also, like the first group, has a sub 10% walk rate. So elite speed, doesn't walk a lot, doesn't strike out a lot, hits the ball on the ground more to utilize that speed. So he's kind of a unique player in that respect. But I would argue again, if you have a player who has that contact ability, so his contact rate is 84.5, so just a tick above league average, and it's hitting the ball hard around 40%, which is not enough to get in our group B, where guys, you know, our Xander Goldie group, but it's hitting the ball hard enough and has that speed. He can still get past that ground ball rate and still post a really good average. So a player that I would throw in this group, it was hard to find amongst the current group. I think it's something where you can maybe apply to.
Can I guess who
Yeah,
you're
go
going to say?
ahead, please. Go ahead.
Ahmed Rosario.
Yeah, you nailed it.
Really?
You nailed it. Yes.
That's funny.
Yeah. Yeah, so he's not a player that I necessarily like from a fantasy perspective or a type of profile I would go after. However, you know, you look at what I looked at is his hard hit rate, his zone contact rate, Um, and his time to first is very comparable to Trey Turner, and he's 26 years old. So he's entering in his peak seasons 27, 28. So what he needs to do is yes, he hits the ground on the ground, ball around on the ground. Getting my exhaustion's kicking in. He hits the ball on the ground a lot, 52%. Trey's at 43%. Trey's launch angle is at 10. His is at 5. So he's really taking that Christian Yelich, super low angle, and he needs to get a little bit more lift. But even with a less than optical launch angle with that kind of speed, he could spike a 290, 300 season.
Sure. His swinging strike rate is also coming down each year. In 17 from 17 until present, it was 18-1, 12-8, 11-6, 11-5, 11-4, and 9-9 last year. He does have an 88.4% zone contact rate in 22. His contact rate, overall contact rate, is lower, I think, than Trey. What did you say Trey's contact rate was?
Trey's in zone contact was 84.5. Ahmed's was 84.6.
Got it. And then he's just he's a really interesting player who I think is still trying to figure out what he is, but he's already super duper productive while trying to figure that out. He had 180 hits last year, right? Which I think was good for 5th in baseball. So already he's got a ton of hits. I think that's a product of volume in some ways, but an underrated fantasy player who I think because of his lack of power is immediately dismissed. But can certainly kind of if we're gonna take the perspective out a little bit, it can be a huge asset to your team if you can surrender. So in the same way that you have like a high steals guy who you might have to compensate in other categories, having Rosario at short could potentially be a huge boost to your team if you have power, a lot of power in other places.
Yeah, for sure.
No,
that's great. I mean, it was for me, this was a great exercise, and I know our goal was to put forth a top 10, but I just trying to find 3 hitters who match these profiles who weren't there. I think it's really going to change. I'm quick to eliminate guys over certain stats that I fetishize. And I think it's just more nuanced than that. And this exercise was a great reminder of that as we start the off season.
I enjoyed it as well. For a number of reasons. I think my biggest takeaways were, one, speed doesn't correlate with average in the same way that I thought it did. 2, that hard hit also is not immediately indicative of high average. You have to dig deeper into the type of player. 3, there is such a thing as an optimal launch angle, right? And if you're looking for specific statistics, but I think the overarching thing that I found when incorporating ground ball rate, right, fly ball rate, so all the top 10 average hitters last year had a ground ball rate that was greater than 37.3, greater than or equal to 37.3, and the 37.3 was Judge, who's kind of the outlier, right?
Yeah.
And that the only 3 that were below 40% were Freddie Freeman, Aaron Judge, and Yordan Alvarez, who are 3 of the best hitters in the game. And then they all had fly ball rates that were less than 39.4, other than Goldschmidt and Judge. So what this kind of, where I arrive at is ground ball and fly ball rates that are really kind of in that 38 to 42% range, right? Something like that, where they're getting even amounts of ground balls and fly balls. You're hitting the ball at a 10 to 15 degree launch angle, and you don't have a ton of swing and miss in your game. I think if you put all of those things together, you can start to find players who at least have high floors and potentially have high ceilings. It impacts me. I was thinking about MJ Melendez and whether I want to keep Melendez. But the more I look at his profile and see how balanced his batted ball metrics are, and the fact that he does strike out some, but he also has tremendous power and walks as well, I think there's a higher ceiling for him than maybe I originally thought based on those metrics. So my takeaway is I will be targeting players that are more balanced in that way. I don't know that I buy completely into there being certain profiles, as far as different buckets that you talked about. I think it's fun to think about it that way, but I don't. I feel like I would be worried that I would miss players that didn't fit into a specific profile if
Oh,
I
for
did it.
sure. Yeah.
But when I'm putting together a team, if I can start with a specific range of launch angle, and I can start with saying, okay, if your ground ball is too high or low and your fly ball is too high or low, let's put you off to the side for now. And then maybe look at you individually later on. I can start to narrow down what players might fit this criteria. So no, I had a ton of fun looking at it, and it helped me to value players like, you realize that Jeff McNeil has a lot more value than we thought he did, right? Coming into the
Right.
season. Or there's a reason to have Luis Ariz on your team. Um, and then just how great, one, just how powerful or superhuman Aaron Judge is. Um, and then also, that Yordan Alvarez, I think is on the ascent. Uh, Three players that I want to touch on real quickly here. I found it interesting that Jose Abreu was eighth in average and he hit
Hmm.
304 because I think he started
Hmm.
off really slowly as well.
Yes.
He's a very low launch angle at 8 degrees for this list, but his line drive and ground ball are very high, and he doesn't pull the ball. He pulls the ball less than league average. So I think he was able to take advantage of the fact um, that he could spray the ball when most every other hitter is just pulling everything. Uh, Andrew Benintendi on the list at 304. I wonder if baseball just doesn't value average in the same way that it used to, because he was a player that was available for a bag of peanuts basically last year. And then Nathaniel Lowe had a really great season, um, but a lot of it was BABIP driven. And he had a 48.1% ground ball rate, which I think is not great for a power hit. That's what is supposed to be a power hitter at first base. Anything else to add with regards to hitters?
My major takeaways were walks aren't as important in and of themselves. And secondly, swinging strikes. There was no one in any of these groups who struck out an exceeding amount.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last takeaway was, yeah, there's a lot of different ways to be successful. There's no one category or no one type that is going to be successful at this category, or in all the categories. Those are my big takeaways. And yes, Abreu hit 217 in March, April last year,
Uh-huh.
263 in May, and then in June, July, and August hit 346, 350, and 333. So you're remembering correctly.
Wow, that's wild.
Too bad the White Sox season was over.
Oh, I know. Um, let's see. You have an open forum question.
I do. Do you want a league construction question, or do you want you managing your roster question? I have two. You can
I want,
choose.
let's do. I like both of those better than mine. Let's do both of yours instead of
Okay.
one of mine.
So my first question is, and I know we're collaborators, friends, and also competitors. So please be as guarded as you would like to be.
I'm
But
never
my question
guarded.
is my question is, is there is there a roster or player decision that is already keeping you up at night going into 2023 for our home league?
Uh, no,
No.
no. What I will say is I am debating whether to try to actively trade Robbie Ray or keep Edward Cabrera. I probably could find a trade match for Edward Cabrera if I decide to keep Robbie Ray. Um, but I think the me 10 years ago would have kept Cabrera and called it a day because I want the high upside pitcher. Um, but I keep forgetting that Robbie Ray is a guaranteed 200 strikeouts, right? And I think that if I didn't have the pitching depth that I have currently, I would it would probably be an immediate keep of Ray, because I would need that I would need his innings and strikeouts. But
Mhm.
to me, Robbie Ray is a high threes, 200 strikeout, high threes ERA, 200 strikeout guy that's going to pitch 175 innings, and that's very valuable. Um, So that's the decision. That's the roster decision I have right now. I'm not keeping any relievers. Um, I am keeping the majority of my pitching. I am keeping my minor league hitters. The cuts that will probably happen. There's the one decision is Polanco and Jimenez versus just Jimenez. So cutting Jorge Polanco, I'll probably end up cutting him. The news that the Yankees are putting IKF and Gleyber Torres on the block is good news for me. So that means Volpe may actually open up the season at short. Um, but no, I think that my immediate trades when the offseason hit kind of cut down the number of roster decisions that I may have moving forward. Uh, I guess the only other one that I really have is I was debating MJ Melendez as well because of the depth at catcher. And my question about Melendez was, is he really any different than any of the top catchers that would have been available to me after the keepers were done? And I've waffled with that, but I've landed on yes, he actually is different, and he's worth keeping for me. Uh,
Nice.
but no, the current really kind of big debate for me is do I keep Robbie Ray or Edward Cabrera? How about you?
Well, my number one headache, I'm gonna keep private. No,
Sure.
but my number two, I will say that I day to day just go back and forth on catcher
Uh-huh.
and what to do with that position.
Uh-huh.
I have just for listeners, watchers, I have in the minors, um, a Dodgers catcher.
Diego
I
Cartagena.
was, yeah, I don't know. I almost said Francisco Mejia. What's wrong with me? Diego Cartea. And then I have a couple of young catchers, Stevenson and Langoliers, and I've waffled between keeping all of them, keeping none of them, just keeping uh, the Dodgers prospect, and it just goes day to day. I have a little PTSD because I kept two catchers last year with Grandal and Stevenson, only to have Grandal, fall flat on his face as he reaches that aging curve, and then Stevenson get two pretty serious injuries back to back. So um, trying to let go of that. That's the past, and you got to make the best decision moving forward. But then also just looking at, there's a lot of depth at catcher, and I think if there's any potential elite catcher down the road, it's probably Cartea. But he's probably also obviously the farthest away. So I think about that a lot.
Can I give you my opinion on it?
Of course you can. We have 2 minutes and 40 seconds. You
I
can give me
know.
your.
Um, I wouldn't keep any of them.
There you go.
The reason being, I think, and we've debated Stevenson a ton.
Yeah, on behalf.
Um, but his BABIP was 409. I'm sorry. His BABIP was 409 and he hit 319. And so I don't see the skills there. And his average exit velocity was 87.1 last year. Um, I just think he's average. And then I think Cartaya is great, but he is far away. And the other thing with Cartaya that brings his value and Melendez's value down for that matter a little bit is there are just a ton of catcher prospects.
Mm-hmm.
Ton. And there's no way to really a lot of them there's no way to differentiate. On
Mm-hmm.
the Monos podcast with Matt, we talked about, we're doing our top 100 right now. And when I look at catcher, you've got Harry Ford, right? You've got Gabriel Moreno, if you're a fan, even a catcher like uh, Austin Wells with the Yankees. There's questions about whether he stays a catcher, but he's really good hitter, left-handed power hitter in Yankee Stadium, who may have multi-positional eligibility. Right, Bo Naylor is another one who's
Yeah.
a really good hitter. So for me, if I have really good players at that 15th keeper spot, and that's my debate, I think it's a pretty clear decision for me, given the
Did either of you guys rank Jefferson Cuero?
did not. Or here's another one, Andy Rodriguez, the catcher for in the Pirates organization. I think
Yeah.
is
And
a
we
dynamite
didn't mention
hitter.
Harry Davis.
Yeah, dynamite hitter. So there's just a ton of them out there. So yes, does Cartaya have star potential? He absolutely does. I'd look for a trade partner with Cartaya and then go into the off season clean. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back with your second roster question. All right, second question.
All right, so my second question is a league format question. So this league has been going for quite some time, and I know we're slow to adopt things, but I have an idea I wanted to run by you on the pod. So my idea was a sort of modified first year player draft, sometime between the end of the AFL and the new year. The idea being that we have 5 minor league spots, and for owners who were interested, they could opt into the draft and draft up to 5 first year players who are not rostered. They have the option maybe to drop a few prospects, maybe who they would like to churn and free up spots to draft players, or they could say, I'm good with my 5 and not participate at all. But the idea was, I think, a couple of reasons. One, just for league involvement, just to have something going on in the offseason other than our redraft in the spring. And then two, I think, there's a lot that changes with prospects at the end of the year as we get full season stats, as new rankings come out, you have the AFL. And then if you identify a player who you think maybe have a chance to compete for a job in spring training, or something like that, you might have an opportunity to acquire him before that happens. Whereas in the spring, everyone's the people who do their investment in the homework, that it's kind of leveled the playing field, right? Because then at that point, all the information is out there, all the new lists are out there. So it's an idea I've thought about putting up on the site of, again, just having an opportunity in the winter to kind of refresh those minor league spots, completely voluntary. And I didn't know if you thought, again, it would have any validity. I think it has very little chance of being adopted because the league is kind of ingrained in its ways. But I do think it has some merit as a way to bring some dynamicism to those 5 spots and to give people an opportunity to bring in more minor leaguers who they're interested in. And then in turn, in the keeper decisions, they might be more likely to keep those young guys because they're excited and they're invested in them. And then that in turn, there might be more interesting veterans or free agents going back into our draft, right? Because you'd have more potentially minor league players being kept who were just drafted, and then they're releasing more veterans into the pool, and that might make our redraft also more dynamic. So I think it might have some different benefits.
So just to clarify, what we're saying is at some point in the off season, each team would have a chance to basically declare how many of those 5 slots they want to open up. And then we draft from the minor league pool to fill any player that's eligible for one of those slots. We would draft. Does that mean that, so you said first year player. Does that mean that there's anybody ineligible to pick up along the way, or does the eligibility stuff still remain over the course of the year that we have now?
Anybody that has a minor league eligibility at the start of the draft. So putting myself in a microscope. So say I only want to keep Ellie and Cartea, right? And then all my other minor prospects, I'm going to release back to the pool before our draft. And so then I would have the opportunity to draft 3 minor leaguers, and then I would incorporate.
Is anyone ineligible to be picked up during the season? Does the eligibility to pick up players during the season change?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I just see it as a way to kind of reshape your minor leagues post minor league season completing, post AFL, and before our redraft.
Right. So I have a couple of thoughts.
Okay.
I think it'd be fun. I don't think it changes anything for me. To me, that's what I see August and September for. Is whatever, if I'm out of contention, you best believe that's literally what I'm doing in August and September with my remaining waiver claims. And if I have to trade for some, I will. I don't know that it would change. I think that what it would do would be to bring the stragglers along, right? Maybe a little bit if they chose to participate. Um, as far as like end of season stats and AFL, I don't really pay much attention to AFL, in large part because I just think that the quality of pitching is really bad. And so it tends to skew some of our perspective on some of the hitters. Teams just aren't willing to risk their high end pitchers in the AFL very often. Um, so I think the AFL is fun and interesting, and I'd love to get down there to be able to watch, but I don't know that it impacts my prospect evaluations much. Um, but I do think that it would be fun having something like that, um, to keep people engaged. I think would be really fun, or to at least to keep us talking together. The one thing that I guess if I would counter, so personally, my vote would be yes, I would participate if that was a thing, but it's not. I don't think it shifts much for me. I would love to do a winter meetings. I did this in a score sheet league in Seattle where I got, I think, 8 of the 10 managers together at the Columbia City Ale House to do a winter meetings where we made a shit ton of trades, drinking beer, having a good time together. That was super, super fun. I love the fact that we're looking for ways to stay engaged or get people together. Um, but as far as a minor league draft goes, my hope would be that managers pay enough attention over the course of the year that nothing changes for them 2 months into the off season, that they're still that their evaluations are their evaluations, right? Um, but that's just, again, that's my perspective. And if everybody was into it, I would 100% engage and buy in for sure. And when I look at my team now and I look at my minor leaguers, um, I'm off the top of my head, I would keep, Tamar's not going anywhere ever. He's probably my next Julio as far as loving players. Cam Collier, I feel that the same way about. I think Cam Collier is for real. And then really the only other minor leaguer I have worth consideration is Kyle Harrison. And Kyle Harrison also isn't going anywhere. So it might be advantageous. I have Robert Hassel, who is kind of on the fence as well. I failed to mention him, but I think Hassel is a future 2020 guy, and Anthony Volpe. So a team like mine, I don't know that I'm going to, if I consider Hassel to be my lowest rated prospect and he's consensus top 30, the only thing I would do if we had a minor league draft would be to probably trade him for something to open up a spot to be able to pick up some other sleeper guy, right?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I think it'd be fun. My question about eligibility was that if it kept me from being able to pick up, when you said first year, I thought maybe you were angling towards not being able to pick up guys who were drafted until that draft, which is what some leagues do. I'd be against that because I think there's the current setup rewards the managers who are willing to look at high school players and anticipate who's going to be drafted where uh, sooner and invest more time in that. And I like being, I like,
No,
any,
I wouldn't want to change that either.
yeah, I like
I
any,
think we might need a modified name. I think that's the name that 100% keeper leagues use each year because that's the only way, when uh, new players come in via the draft or the international
yes,
signing. It's the way that they come into the league. So
right.
when is the international signing period?
July 2nd is when it starts.
July. Okay.
Uh-huh.
That'd be like a midsummer thing. Okay.
Right. But I keep looking for, I wish we were in more constant communication with everybody. And actually, I have a quick question for you, and I know we're trying to wrap up here. Where do we all go if there's no Twitter? Right?
Honestly, um I don't really know what's going on. I've heard just secondhand if there's stuff going on with Twitter, but like it's the only social media that I engage in. Like I will post um I will post like when our pod goes up on there, and then that's like how I've connected with Eno and
Yep.
a couple other guys in the industry, and that is sort of the one outlet I have for connecting with the community at large, the fantasy baseball community. So I don't know where I would go, I guess, is the answer to your question. Don't have a ton of engagement on it, but it is the one area I make an effort to kind of like reach out with for this effort and this venture specifically.
Right. Yeah, I don't really know. It's my only social media as well, and I don't really know where I'll go either. I hope that the momentum that some of the individuals within the fantasy baseball community have created, right? Um, that we don't lose that momentum as a community. I'm sure something else will pop up and we'll figure it out. It's not, I don't, it can't be that difficult, right? But it is kind of interesting to be in this place where, and it is real, Twitter could just completely collapse the
Mm.
way that they're going right now. So it'll be interesting to see where we land. Um, any other thoughts?
No, that's it, man. I got to run today.
Cool.
It's
Well, I
great to
got
talk to you.
one more quick one. Any
Yeah.
prospects you got your eyes on?
Yes.
Okay, sounds good. I appreciate
That,
you, man.
that'll bring everyone back.
Right? Talk soon.